Sebastian Gluck,
Yes.
It's wonderful having you here to have a chance to speak with you today.
Thank you, sir.
So you're a historian, you're a musician, an organ player yourself, you're an architect, and you're an organ builder.
Yes.
We are here sitting in a synagogue talking about organs. What's going on here?
Well, it's very interesting that, particularly in the United States, there's this notion that the pipe organ does not belong in the synagogue, even though in the past 30 years I've documented about 500 pipe organs built for American synagogues, some of which rivaled the organs in concert halls. And the whole culture of choral music and organ music in the synagogue was something that I always thought was normal. I grew up in a conservative shul, and the chazan there, Robert H. Siegel, who trained me for my bar mitzvah, published an important book called Responsive Singing. And that was a book where you not only had the service music, but the notation. And it returned to the idea that developed during the height of Reform, that we should all sing together, that there should be a grandeur and dignity to the service. And it had absolutely nothing to do with wanting to be a church. And I think that fear actually developed probably in the 1970s, even though we were still building synagogue organs. But the organ and the choir, as part of the synagogue service, goes back to the 18th century, when rabbis in Europe were building organs for their shuls.
So let's go back to understand the context and history here. So we're in the 18th century. You're telling me that rabbis want to build organs in their synagogues. Why?
There was an idea that it sort of came from the Jewish Enlightenment, and of course the general intellectual Enlightenment, that worship for the Jew could be participatory, and that the organ and choir had an adjunct leadership role. Of course, you had the rabbi, you had the chazan, but to get people singing communally, they would need to be singing the same melody at the same pitch, the same rhythms. By the time immigrants came to the United States, there was this chaotic mumbling that went on, and people didn't know all the words, they didn't know the same melodies. And when Reform came to the United States, I think people think it meant just become a church, where in fact conservatism and Reform came from a flow of modern ideas. It wasn't just that we should suddenly look like a church.
Although that must have been part of that as well.
Sure.
You're speaking about Enlightenment trying to be, right, we're talking about Berlin and Vienna, try to look like our neighbors, to assimilate into the current culture.
And assimilationist culture, in fact, took hold very strongly. And Mendelssohn is always a good example, because he converted, was a very fine organist. He had two business cards, one with his fake, Mendelssohn Bartholdy, and one that just said Jakob Ludwig Felix Mendelssohn. So there was that assimilationist note, but certainly not in the architecture. We developed these spectacular Moorish buildings. There was a visual iconography to Jewish architecture in the United States that sort of came out of Germany, Austria, Hungary. But community singing in a dignified manner meant that you had the organ. You often had a composer in residence. Isaac Wise would have orchestras. And they also understood that the organ could do things that no other instrument could.
So what is it about the organ? Why would organ become the center of responsive singing or participatory service? Why? What is so special about the organ that facilitates that feel?
Well, two things. Organ pipes do what we do. They sing. They move air in a particular way. An organ frequently has several keyboards, which means you can have one that's playing more softly, a certain selection of voices that gives the chazan his pitch. You can go to the next keyboard, and then the quartet alone sings, or sometimes it was a double quartet in the 19th century. And then you could move to the largest keyboard and couple the other keyboards to it, and the whole congregation would sing together. And so when you have an organ where you can hold a note, and in theory, as long as the power stays on, you can hold that note forever. And you may say, well, why can't we do that with a piano or a guitar? Well, those don't have a steady state tone. It fades very quickly. But and also they don't have the power to shake the building, which is an emotional effect, a physical, emotional involvement with the experience of the prayer service.
Well, the organ is also a large instrument. It has a very warm sound. It has a lot of optionality in terms of the sound and a lot of combinations, a lot of flexibility. But it also, there is something that there's a certain powerful and sound that architecturally surrounding you. So when you sit in a sanctuary, you feel like you're immersed in that sound.
Well, here at Park Avenue is a very good example of that, because there was a movement of the organ around the synagogue. So in the very earliest synagogue organs, they were in the back balcony, speaking down the length of the sanctuary, because that was the traditional place it was and it was the most acoustically advantageous. If you went to a European concert hall, it was often right behind the stage. Of course, we have the Aron Kodesh there. We don't put the organ there. But eventually it moved above the bima. And then toward the teens and the 20s of the last century, when the beautiful buildings were being designed by architects who also designed movie palaces, that the exoticism of Judaism invited exotic buildings. So the organ began to be split behind decorative grills on either side of the bima. And then when electricity was really introduced into the organ action to signal the pipes to open and close, one of the most important developments in the synagogue organ was what they call the echo organ. Now, that started in the turn of the last century in San Francisco, and they put a few stops in the dome. So during the Amidah, the mourner's Kaddish, you would have this sound floating down. Here it was in the back of the room. But that if you're surrounded by an organ and you're surrounded by other people singing and you're being led by a choir, it wasn't a spectator sport. So you're not watching the choir or listening to the choir and sitting there. You have 4 wonderful singers, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, their names were always in the newspapers when they announced what music was going to be sung in the synagogue. But they led this communal singing. and everyone was on the same page and the same note at the same time.
It's very interesting because when we go even further back, we would have a congregation of people who would sing along with the cantor or even mumble the prayers. Some people, of course, over the history, not everybody could recite the prayers themselves, which is what I owe my job for, right? The creation of a professional cantor who is supposed to know all the prayers and lead the congregation. But people were definitely part of that. And then we see a turn to a more orderly fashion a service where the cantor and the choir takes over the role of the congregation. All the congregation has to do is sit quietly and dress nicely. I'm talking about, right, certain era in Europe that people didn't have to do anything. It was a very passive experience. And then we go exactly, and then we go back to a democratization of the prayer that everybody is responsible for. And but it's interesting that you are pointing out that the organ was not part of the time to take something away from the congregation, but in fact was supposed to facilitate a congregational singing.
And that's one of the things that Cantor Siegel wanted to do at B'nai Jeshurun, which really identified as conservative. So, and this is again the notion that Reform Judaism wasn't just one thing, but we had reforms that could be put into place. So we wore our kippot, our talilot. We sat with our families. So I remember as a child, my mother and grandmother would go off behind the barrier, and I'd be there with my father and my grandfather. But the idea of keeping the family unit together, of having some of the service in English, so you knew what you were praying about, you knew what you were talking about. And now in American Reform, of course, it was, the services were in German, not in English. And in the Spanish and Portuguese synagogues, of course, they would have the same thing, that your native language was included. That was a reform. But it didn't mean you took communion and got baptized. So conservative synagogues had, were walking that line between not assimilating, and yes, there were some Midwestern synagogues after the Civil War who were saying, let's have our services on Sunday. That didn't work. That was a little too far. The organ was fine, and the organ brought people together. The term shul, school, meant that the shul also had lectures, organ recital every Friday night before, and it wasn't a service prelude. People came because for many congregants, it was their one chance to hear live classical music. And another thing that came out of this culture was the division of music into ancient chant, the folk tradition, service music, and sort of classical choral music. And there were some theories that the use of the folk song and the use of popular song negated the experience of being in shul. And now we talk about accessibility. But in fact, if what you're singing in church or in synagogue is so similar to what you hear playing when you're going shopping, and it's too much of the common experience, then the sacred experience of going to shul on Shabbat, not just the way we dress, but the way we comport ourselves, the music we listen to, the way we sing together, that it has to be differentiated from what we do commonly on a daily basis.
So we're going to get to that in a minute. I just want to understand, how many synagogues are we talking about in America that built an organ for their sanctuary? Mm-hmm. And last time I checked, an organ is a very expensive and involved instrument to build, to maintain. Where did they get the funds to do this? We're talking about immigrants who came from Europe. Explain to me, how many synagogues are we talking about? What's the magnitude of a cost of an organ at the time? And why did they make it a priority to actually get an organ when they build a synagogue?
From what I've uncovered in the past 3 decades, between 400 and 500 congregations. And
where in America, geographically?
Everywhere.
Huh.
It's surprising. Montana, Idaho, Arizona, Texas. We think of the centers of classical reform, Louisville, Cleveland, Cincinnati, New York. But even in places we think of as normally Catholic, a good example would be Ohabe Shalom in Brookline, where they not only built a spectacular building, they didn't build the tower that went with it. They ran short of funds on that. But what they did have funds for was an organ that was designed by the chair of the New England Conservatory, who wrote a monograph on the organ in France after he studied with the composers and organists there, and he made sure that Ohabe Shalom had this French-style symphonic organ, which they don't use anymore. It's sitting there rotting. But they felt that it was important. A pattern that I've seen is that the women's auxiliary often raised the money for the organ. And if there were special divisions like the Echo Division, it was usually the men's club. But the women's auxiliary would have not only fairs, but private card parties. And these were all announced in the newspapers.
It's a lot of money. What are we talking about back in I don't know, in the 1920s maybe? How much money would it be to build an organ back in
I'm just working on a very interesting chapter in my upcoming monograph on B'nai Israel in Cincinnati. It was their 6th building, and they kept building larger buildings and larger organs. Now, in 1905, the contract read $9,000. I imagine, I don't know what's that worth now. They did take competitive bids, and it's interesting because the organ committees that selected the builders and the instruments for synagogue were often made up not necessarily of the professoriate. It was usually they would hire or consult with musicians and intellectuals about the design of the organ. But on the business end, it was successful merchants and often they were members of civic associations, fraternal lodges. Another interesting thing that's emerging is that because so many congregations began early to meet, they didn't have a minyan, they would meet in someone's living room, but the next step would be rented quarters, and then they would move to the Masonic Lodge. Masonic lodges have pipe organs that are designed to accompany groups of male voices and male soloists. So that was a natural way into how do we accompany the Shabbos service. We have, and as you know, there were to be a chazan in the late 19th or early 20th century in the United States was to be a star. And you could buy these photographs and postcards, and some of them were really quite dashing. And they had reputations of being gallant, talented, charming, and often a lyric baritone, but sometimes there would be a star tenor. And star tenors let you know that they're star tenors. But you had this framework in the lodge where you had male soloists, male choirs. B'nai Jeshurun had a male choir in addition to the mixed choir and the community choir and their orchestra. So it's a very interesting and complex evolution. And that goes back to the point of how did we get to the grand conservative tradition and the Reformed tradition.
So again, before we go there, just one more question. So I understand that the cantors of the time were supposed to be trained singers and musicians to be able to sing with an organ, which is an art to itself. And the choir members, of course. Who were the organists these days? I don't recall that Jewish mothers would encourage their children to go and pursue organ studies. That sounds like
Mine didn't.
Okay, all right. So what was that like? Who were the organists that played these beautiful instruments?
Were not Jewish. There were a couple who were sort of in the teens and 20s, but in general, the congregations sought out sort of well-known choral conductors, orchestral conductors, professors. They saw it in some ways as an academic position. And because music in the synagogue is collaborative, you have an accompanimental force, which is the organ. In the 19th century, string orchestras were common. And often there was a concert before the service that had organ, maybe string quartet or string trio, flute players, harps were very common. And you'd have a concert program. We don't realize now how much Jewish congregations liked the music of Handel. But it was all, so much organ music and so much choral music is not Christian. And Handel was kind of a hero because of the Old Testament oratorios, some beautiful concerti. But it all came, it was gradual, but they also realized we're not going to be getting Jewish organists. And in more conservative schools, certainly the choir and the organist were not Jewish.
And what about the composers? Somebody had to create music for those synagogues that have organs and choirs and trained cantors.
Well, a lot of that descended from the Central European, Austro-Hungarian school, and you had, Sulzer, Dunayevsky, Lewandowski, and that they set out, these were Jews who set out to write Jewish service music. Later on, you had Darius Milhaud writing a Shabbos service with an orchestra and organ. Nobody plays it, but the score exists. And if you are in a conservative mindset and you say, okay, are we working, if we're playing the organ and we're singing, are we working on Shabbos? Then you hire non-Jews. And in the case of most synagogues, it was, let's hire the best we can. So Temple Beth El here in New York, a gentleman named Clarence Dickinson, one of the great church musicians, professors of organ, conductors. He designed the organ. He was organist there.
Beth El, you mean, which one? In New York City?
In New York City, the one that eventually merged with Emmanuel.
I see.
And that building has been razed. the chapter in my book is like 30 pages on it. We have all of his correspondence and about how the organ was to be designed and how it was to be used for the service. So he would say, you don't understand how important this stop is for the Kaddish, or how important this is for silence devotion. So you had people, non-Jews who were experienced synagogue musicians, but came to understand the experience of the Shabbos service. And they designed these organs in such a way that they could do things that no other instrument could do, including get louder as the notes were held. So that if a congregation were lagging, you could push a pedal, shutters would open, and the pipes behind would be more free to speak, and people would be energized to sing. So it was not, except for the composers, and we find more and more that the cantors were composing, because they knew what they wanted to sing, and they also knew the liturgy of the service.
Right. So what was the golden age of organs in synagogues in America?
There were, I would say, there were two main bursts of building. Certainly following the Civil War, it was just spectacular stuff. There's one in Temple Emmanuel here in New York. The building's gone, the organ's gone. But it started a trend in these grand concert organs, of wildly beautiful. It's a Temple Emmanuel organ. Every pipe was stenciled. And the architect of that organ was a man named Leopold Eidlitz. And he designed organs in addition to synagogues and commercial buildings and things like that. And his work has always been attributed to an organ builder named George Jardine, but it was actually this Jewish architect. And that was when the German Romantic school of organ building was very big. The British invasion coincided with the turn of the 20th century, and that's when we had a lot of English organ builders coming over here, and it was the third phase of the Industrial Revolution. So that instead of the organ being all together in one spot, you could start moving sections of it about the building, in the dome, in the back balcony, split on either side. And that was, then we started getting a grand English style of organ building in the teens and 20s. And the late 1920s was just, I think, the height of everything. And the advantage of the English style of organ building is great choral singing came out of the English cathedral. Now, no one was trying to be an English cathedral. We were trying to be great synagogue choirs. So I would say that was the second thing. After the Second World War, synagogues moved to the suburbs. And modern architecture, we didn't have the space, and they didn't make the space because the artificial electronic organ came in. And they said, well, you don't need 4 stories chambers to put your pipes in, you know. And then after a while, it just faded out until the 60s and 70s. There was another flourish of neoclassical organ building. But I would say the era really from like 1917 to 1935. And of course, Park Avenue falls right into the middle of that.
Right.
And the building was designed to accommodate a sizable organ. And in fact, it was kind of a large organ for the room. There's a hierarchy to the number of keyboards in an organ, and that has meaning in effect. So
what happens then in the 50s and 60s, or let me ask this differently? So what led to the organ becoming not so prominent in a synagogue anymore, and even later get some resistance and people want to push the organ out? How did this happen?
It's interesting because when I first started the project, and I would call up a synagogue and say, may I speak to the archivist? And I was assured that there was no organ. It's like, well, I have 220 pages of documents and the blueprints and the newspaper articles and the concert announcements and the photographs of your organist. You did have an organ. It's not possible. Now, I find it interesting that as a culture, one of our mantras is never forget. But the idea then that this can all be obliterated, when it was really a high point in our culture, I don't understand. But I do know that in the 1960s, we had an American cultural revolution against formality and the old guard. At the same time that there were sort of directives from Rome that that Catholic churches could use vernacular instruments. They could saw off the front of the altar and move it forward and have the celebrant face the congregation, so that there was this fear of the grand, and that somehow that meant that you were bringing people in. But when you take away the specialness, it reminds me of a story my late parents taught me. They knew someone who was the chair of the Belgian Communist Party. And they had breakfast with him one day, and it was just strawberries and champagne and everything else. And they said, well, what are you doing? And we thought this was you were the chair of the party, and that you championed the common man. He said, well, yes, I think we should all have strawberries and champagne. But I think then that the fear that somehow we were going to become Christian, and that what had to take over was something ordinary and informal, and returning to the chaos that the original reformers disliked. I recently was at a conservative shul here in New York. I hadn't been there in decades. My first hater was there, and they had an organ that was not built for the building. It was built for the mansion of a great industrialist, and brought there. And I remember there was an octet that sang. It was hidden, of course, but you could see the organs right over the bima, and a very, very dignified service. And then what I saw there was people weren't even participating. The chazan was kind of just rocking back and forth and doing the lie, 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 and everyone else was mumbling. And I thought back to the vitality of the organ, the professional singers who were section leaders for the congregation. And there was that vitality when 400, 600, 800 people are singing at the same time. And that was made possible by the organ. And not entirely, you need this will to do it. But there's a security when you have backup. And as long as that organ is playing, then you can find your note. When a culture decides on any level, this is not just worship, not just liturgical music, not just religion, but on any level, that something is too good for you, then it's rather demeaning. And so if you are offended by exquisiteness, even though it's inviting you to be exquisite along with it, things fall apart. And I think it's interesting nowadays, we're seeing in American culture this embracing of the lowbrow culture. It's not doing us any good. So it's not just liturgical music. It's not just the Shabbos service. It's not just the church service. So I think as these organs have been destroyed, somebody asked me, is your book going to be called The Lost Synagogue Organs? It's like, they weren't lost. They were destroyed, and we destroyed them. And that's very difficult. But I also knew it had to be documented, and it had to be documented by somebody who knew about the buildings, the design of synagogues, had built a couple dozen organs, played the organ, and grew up in that tradition. And this will be on the library shelves so that if every last synagogue throws out their organ, they will know that 500 of them were built, and how beautiful the buildings were, how beautiful the organs were to look at. And as I said, there was a time when they were hidden, but that was an architectural taste. You saw that in churches too, giant organs behind grills. But in the 1960s, there was a style where you saw all the pipes again, and they were arranged as modern sculpture, not as formal pieces of furniture. So they're still out there, but I wanted to document just the wealth and breadth of what American Jews had accomplished. And as you said, how was this money raised? It was raised diligently by people who really believed that this was essential. It started out as a fixture, so that in the pioneer days, these newly minted communities, well, you had to put up a shul. So you bought an organ, you bought the pews, you bought the chandeliers, you bought the doorknobs. But in the 20s, when there was so much wealth generated by anywhere from Jewish movie moguls to natural resources, that you had this Jewish community that was not just wealthy, but highly educated. And that this was just part of the whole thing. You had whether you had an art collection and gave it to a museum, or you were successful in business and gave the organ to the temple. It's a big achievement and a huge part of our culture that we just can't say never happened.
So this is very interesting to understand the progression of that. I want to turn into the future for a second. Mm-hmm. Do you think organs are really gone and they will never come back? Or do you think there is an argument to be made of restoring the integrity of the building, of the architecture, tuning in to the spiritual capabilities of an organ, to the aesthetics of that, to the possibilities that can come with an organ? Is there any chance that organs will ever come back to synagogues?
Well, fortunately, they already have. Certainly, the instruments I built at Temple Emmanuel here, the Wilshire Boulevard Temple just restored a very important organ there, and the building, which had fallen into great disrepair. The Plum Street temple in Cincinnati, not only restored the building, but restored the organ and commissioned a chapel organ. It's a very, very highly important organ, and our greatest surviving example from that German Romantic era. So, yes, it's already started. I hope it isn't too late. So many congregations destroyed the organs. They decided that the space designed for the organ by the architects at the request of the congregation originally was more important to use for storage. And it was never intended that way. So I think what one has to do first is reassess what the Shabbos service is supposed to be. Now, for me, when you walk into a building, any sacred space, your physiology changes. There's that little bit of awe, but there's also that relaxation. It's also silent. Now, if it's a reverberant building, you hear your footsteps on the floor. And you know that this is not the outside world.
It's a sanctuary.
Exactly, and that's why we call it that. And so that when people came to synagogue and they would hear live classical music half an hour, 15 minutes beforehand, that was considered part of the service, part of the Shabbos service, even though it was listed separately. And that was that space between the outside experience and the devotional experience. And that occurs in architecture. We have, the famous Frank Lloyd Wright. You came into this tiny little vestibule, and then it opened up into the room. For us, we enter the sanctuary, and then there's the bima, and then the Aron Kodesh. We have this progression of spaces, but they're also a progression of experiences and a procession of them. And so to then know that, and this is what Cantor Siegel did, and that's why he published his book, was you could open the book and he would have transliterations phonetically, but there was also English and the Hebrew in our Siddurim. So you knew what you were singing, what it meant, how to pronounce it, and everybody had the same melody, and the organ was leading you, and if you had a sore throat or didn't want to sing, you could listen to everyone else. But it was group sport. And if you're not doing that, in some ways you're all sitting next to each other, but not in community. Mm-hmm. I think there is a future. I'm hoping that this monograph will make people aware that, and it's not that, everyone in the Oregon Historical Society who subscribes to this and gets their name printed in it is going to be oohing and aahing over it. I would like cantors to see it, rabbis to see it. This all begins in the seminary, in every religion. And the crisis in music has turned around in some denominations, and they're commissioning big organs, and they're hiring academics who really understand the breadth of hundreds of years of great liturgical music. It has to start in the seminary, and it has to start in the cantorate and the rabbinate. And it can't just come from the Jewish kid who is no longer a kid by any stretch, who spent 30 years going on this treasure hunt. So I think there's a future, and that if people break away from the notion that we're all suddenly going to be wearing crucifixes, it's not true. And they have to also understand that at what point do you deprive yourself of something so wonderful just because you fear it? So,
Sebastian, thank you very much for speaking with me today.
Thank you.
And I hope that people will be exposed to your book, that people will understand and realize that great tradition, that great chapter in Jewish history in America. And as you described, that these sounds and capabilities and architecture of an organ is something that will definitely come back and will become a part of the beautiful mosaic that is called Jewish music.
I hope so.
Here at Park Avenue Synagogue, we definitely feel that this is part of our heritage, and this is something that we ought to preserve. Whether it's the main part of the service or not, I don't know what the future is going to be like, but I hope that this is, again, a link in the chain, midor ledor, as we say, that people will always remember and learn to appreciate and hopefully enjoy for many years to come.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.